Cape Kennedy, Florida. November 1969. It is raining. The President of the United States is in the viewing stands, the first sitting president ever to watch a crewed launch in person. At 22 minutes past 11, the Saturn V carrying Apollo 12 climbs off the pad into a gray, dripping sky. For 36 seconds, everything is normal. Then the sky connects to the rocket. A channel of white fire runs down through the vehicle, down its long trail of ionized exhaust, and strikes near the pad below. Inside the capsule, the warning panel lights up almost end to end. 3 astronauts are riding a 36-story machine that has just been hit by lightning, and nobody on the ground can read their spacecraft anymore. Tonight, we open thin margins on the quantum files, true stories of the moment spaceflight nearly failed, and the thin human margins that held. Episode 1 is the most famous single call in the history of mission control, SCE to AUX. Rewind to that morning. The weather at the Cape was ugly. Overcast, rain showers, and winds aloft that would turn out to be the strongest ever flown through by an Apollo ascent. There was a rule against launching into a cumulonimbus cloud, a thunderstorm cloud, and the weather team saw no lightning anywhere near the pad that morning. By the written rules of 1969, this sky was legal. What nobody fully appreciated yet is that a Saturn V does not have to fly into a storm to find lightning. It can create it. The rocket and its exhaust plume form a conductive path far longer than the rocket itself. A moving lightning rod connecting layers of charged cloud toward the ground. NASA's own analysis later concluded the clouds that day probably could not have produced lightning on their own. The vehicle triggered the discharge by flying through them. Apollo 12 did not get hit by the weather. Apollo 12 was the trigger. Twice. Inside the command module, the first strike lands as a flash and a shudder. The voltage spike knocks all 3 fuel cells offline in an instant. Fuel cells are the spacecraft's power plants. With them gone, the entire ship falls back on its batteries, which cannot carry the full load. Voltage sags. Alarm lights cascade across the panel. 16 seconds later, at 52 seconds into flight, a second discharge hits the vehicle. This one tumbles the guidance platform, the spinning reference that tells the crew which way is up. Commander Pete Conrad keys his mic and tells Houston, "Okay, we just lost the platform, gang. I don't know what happened here. We had everything in the world drop out. And yet, the rocket keeps flying straight." Here is the first hidden margin. The Saturn V's guidance lived in its own instrument unit, a separate brain in the booster, electrically independent of the wounded spacecraft above the fire. The capsule was blind. The booster was not. In Houston, Mission Control had a different crisis. The telemetry stream, the river of numbers that tells the ground what the spacecraft is doing, had turned to garbage. Not zeros. Garbage. Random-looking values on every screen that mattered, covering power, fuel cells, batteries, and life support. Flight Director Jerry Griffin was working his first launch in the chair, and the safe textbook answer was sitting right there. Abort. Pull the crew off the rocket, splash them into the Atlantic, and lose the mission. An abort off a flying Saturn V had never been done. In this phase of ascent, it meant firing the escape tower, ripping the capsule away from the stack at high speed, and trusting parachutes nobody could inspect. It would risk the crew on an untested escape sequence to solve a problem nobody had even diagnosed yet. But continuing meant riding toward orbit, with a spacecraft no one on the ground could read. The room had seconds to choose, and the only person with a third option was a 26-year-old 2 rows back. At the far console sat John Aaron, the flight controller responsible for the electrical systems, a job mission control called EECOM. About a year earlier, during a routine ground test, Aaron had watched telemetry dissolve into a strange pattern of nonsense values. And instead of shrugging, he had chased it down. The cause was a power drop to one obscure box, the signal conditioning equipment, the electronics that translate raw sensor readings into numbers the ground can display. Starve that one box, and the data does not go to zero. It goes to exactly the kind of garbage now filling every screen in mission control. Aaron looked at the noise and recognized it. His call lasted 2 seconds. "Flight, EECOM. Try SCE to AUX," he said. Griffin had never heard of the switch. The capsule communicator had to ask where it was. Aboard the spacecraft, Conrad heard the words and did not recognize them either. One person in the loop knew that panel cold. Lunar Module pilot Alan Bean, the crew's engineer, reached for the lower right corner of the console and moved one 3-position switch to auxiliary. "Put the clock on the wall." The first strike hits at 36.5 seconds. The second at 52. Aaron's call goes up, and the instruction reaches the crew about 96 seconds after liftoff. Bean throws the switch, and by about a minute 50, clean data is flowing back to Houston. From catastrophe to diagnosis in roughly 1 minute, while the vehicle accelerated toward staging. With telemetry restored, the ground could finally see the real damage, and it was survivable. Bean put the fuel cells back on the buses, and Apollo 12 reached orbit on schedule. Then came the quiet part of the save. Instead of firing straight onto the moon, the crew spent the better part of 2 orbits checking the spacecraft end to end before committing. One worry stayed on the ground. Some engineers feared the strike might have damaged the pyrotechnics that release the parachutes. There was no way to test it and no way to fix it, so managers made a cold, honest call. Say nothing. Knowing would change nothing except the crew's next 10 days. On November 24th, the parachutes worked. So, what actually held? Look at the scoreboard. The fuel cells failed, and battery backup carried the load just long enough. The telemetry failed, and one backup power position on one obscure box brought it back. The capsule's platform tumbled, and the booster's independent guidance never blinked. And the humans held. A controller who had studied a failure nobody assigned him to study. An astronaut engineer who knew every switch on his panel. A flight director who trusted a specialist's 2-second call instead of reaching for the abort handle. None of that was luck. Margin is designed and margin is rehearsed. The lesson was also expensive and real. NASA rewrote its Lightning launch rules so that a vehicle-triggered strike could not be legal weather again. 5 days later, Pete Conrad and Alan Bean landed within walking distance of the Surveyor 3 probe, the first pinpoint landing on another world, flown by a mission that nearly ended at 36 seconds. Scoreboard the idea one last time. A 2-second call, made by a 26-year-old, based on one afternoon of curiosity a year earlier, saved a $400 million lunar mission, and maybe 3 lives. Mission Control gave John Aaron its rarest title for it. Steely-Eyed Missile Man. That is the register this series is written in. Thin Margins is not a catalog of disasters. It is a catalog of holds. The near misses where the physics said no, and the design, the training, or one prepared human said not today. Next time, more moments on the edge. A fire, a spin, a hatch, a hole. Each one a margin measured in seconds, and each one thinner than anyone planned. This was thin margins on the quantum files. If you want the next close call when it lands, subscribe to the quantum files. The margins are thin. That is why the people matter.